week of this series entitled The Storyteller, which focuses on these things called parables, which are stories with a spiritual point that Jesus tells, in this case, in the Gospel of Luke. We're focused on stories that he tells that you only find in the Gospel of Luke, and there's quite a few of them. We're actually not covering all of those that you would find. Here's the story that we are going to focus on today and in this series with. It comes to us very late in Jesus' life, not too soon before Palm Sunday that we celebrate today. This is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18. Jesus also told this parable. By the way, it's the second in a row that he's going to tell on prayer. He just told one in verses 1 to 8 in this chapter. This is a second that's about prayer, but really, as you'll see, it's not about prayer. It's about how every human being has to answer some very basic questions about their own life. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were justified and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple. This would be the temple in Jerusalem, the heart and the center of Judaism in his day. These two men went to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, that would be a religious leader, someone who in this culture at this time would have been one of the most highly respected and highly regarded. If you had a spiritual question, if you had a life question, odds are the person that you would go to get an answer in that culture was a Pharisee. And the other was a tax collector. If the Pharisee is the most highly regarded person in Jewish culture, then the tax collector is the least regarded. He is considered a traitor to his own race. He is an employee of the Roman Empire who can effectively tax his fellow countrymen to whatever degree he wants. And he has the muscle of the Roman Empire behind him to enforce it. Odds are the audience to this story would have not even thought that a tax collector would have ever even dared go to the temple to pray at all. In fact, many in the audience that day listening to this story would have assumed that a tax collector, doing what he did, being who he was, didn't pray at all in his life. And these two men go up to the temple to pray. The Pharisee, standing by himself there in the temple courts, was praying this way, quote, "God, I thank you that I am not like other people. I'm not a thief, a rogue, an adulterer, or even like that tax collector over there. I fast twice a week, that is, I withhold from myself food and perhaps even drink twice a week as a spiritual discipline, and I give a tenth or I tithe off of every single thing that I earn, my income." But the tax collector was standing far off. Odds are he's standing in the corner of one of those temple courts, probably in the shadows, so he can't be seen, because he knows he's a persona non grata. He knows he's not welcome. So there he stands, cowering in the shadows in the corner, standing afar off, and he wouldn't even look up to heaven, but he was beating his chest in emotional turmoil, saying, "God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner." And Jesus continues, "I tell you, this man, the tax collector, went to his home that day justified, rather than the Pharisee. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted." That day, in the audience that was listening to this parable, you can assume one thing about their reaction to this story. They would have assumed they're neither of the people or the characters in the story. Very few people listening that day would have been Pharisees. I am a Pharisee, or the modern equivalent. I am a pastor, so by my office and my profession, my calling and my training, I am a Pharisee. I'm the only one in the room. You are not a Pharisee. Many that day weren't either. But they also wouldn't have considered themselves a tax collector, the lowest of the low. the worst of the worst. And yet it is in this story about people who are not like you that you're going to find things that are deeply true about your life. And more to the point, you're going to find that they are showing you two different ways to answer some of the basic fundamental questions that every single human being carries around with them and tries to answer for themselves all throughout their life on this earth. This story hinges on two very churchy, Bible-y sounding words. It hinges on the word justified and the word exalted. These two characters in this story were both trying to find a way to be both of these things. Now let me help you unpack these Bible-y sounding words and maybe make them a little more relatable to your own life, to your everyday experience. What does it mean to be justified? You and I, fundamentally, as human beings, carry around the question within our hearts, even if it's not always on the front of our conscious mind, am I good enough? Am I doing enough? Have I grown enough? Have I achieved enough? Am I good enough? That's what the word justified means. And not only am I okay with myself or am other people okay with me, fundamentally we all want to know whether or not God is okay with us. That's what the word justified means here in this passage. And we all, every day of our lives, every week of our lives, but in certain seasons you sense this far more than others, we want to be at peace with ourselves. We want to be able to sleep well at night. We want to be comfortable in our own skin. We want to have peace of mind. Yeah, those questions are the questions about how you and I will be justified in life. Exalted works the same way. You would never use of yourself the word, I want to be exalted. You're not royalty, and neither am I. No one has to kneel in your presence. I hope that's not the way you parent. However, it didn't work. Nice. Doesn't work in my house either, I assure you. But we all wonder, am I important? Am I significant? Will other people recognize in me how I am valuable or I am important? Or do I have to drag it out of them that they see why I'm worthwhile or what I contribute to them and to the world around me, to my job, to my home, etc.? So while you see the word justified and exalted in this passage, you might think, gosh, I don't know even what that means. What's it have to do with me? Now I hope you understand those two words have everything to do with you, and they have everything to do with me. And frankly, they are some of the most important questions, some of the most basic questions you and I as human beings have to wrestle with throughout our decades on this planet. And so now what we want to do is we want to look at the two ways that Jesus says in his story, these two characters, a Pharisee and a tax collector, answered the questions of how we will be justified here as we live. How will you be good enough? How will you know if God's okay with you? How will you find peace of mind? Where will your value come from? And there are two very distinct ways that these characters answer that. Let's talk about the Pharisee to start with. This spiritual leader, this trusted religious voice, this person to whom you would turn for counsel in that culture about all things spiritual or about the real tough things in your life. Jesus says in the story that one of the ways he sought to justify himself, one of the ways he tried to feel good about himself and come to terms with himself and be okay with himself, is he did it through comparison. Did you catch that? There he stands in the temple to pray with his eyes open, and we're all Christians here. We all go to church here. That's the first mistake he made, right? We all know God doesn't answer prayers with your eyes open. His mistake was he should have been praying with his eyes closed. No, I'm kidding. He's praying with his eyes open, and he's looking at the people around him. And he says, God, I am thankful that I am not like these people I see, or I know out in my little part of the world. I'm thankful that I'm not a thief, I'm not a rogue, I'm not an adulterer, and I'm not like that tax collector cowering over in the corner who can't even look to heaven. He compares. And here's the thing. All human beings do this. We try to feel good about ourselves on occasion by looking down on others. We try to feel favorably about ourselves by looking unfavorably on others. We find the ways that they are different from us, and namely, we find the ways we think they're worse than us. Psychologists call this the instinct in human beings to self-justification, and we all got it. The Pharisee is not alone in that. Can you identify in yourself maybe an occasion in the past where you used comparison with other people to feel good about you, regardless of how it made you feel about that other person? Where you, even if you never verbalized it out loud, went through the exercise in your head and said, well, at least I'm not him, or at least I'm not her. Man, I may be struggling with my teenager, but at least my teenager is not like that teenager that I know who seems to be tearing their family apart right now. I may not be the best employee at my workplace, but at least I'm not that one who is assuredly the worst. I may not be the nicest guy in the world, but at least I'm not my boss who seems to treat people poorly and with no respect. You know, I may not do everything at church. I may not volunteer for everything. I may only do a few basic things, but at least I'm not that person who comes in late all the time and doesn't seem to contribute anything to the life of our church. And on the list goes. Comparison ruins marriages. You get that, right? It destroys friendships too. Because we instinctively want to compare how much we're doing to how little we think they are. And the truth is, if we were to ask them to be honest about what's going on in their head, it's probably the same conversation reversed. They feel like they're the one doing more, and we're the one doing less. My point to you is just this. This is one way that human beings, like the Pharisee in the story, tend to try to feel okay about who we are. This is how we try to find peace of mind, through comparison. Did you catch the other very concrete thing that he did in the story? He made a list. There he stands in the temple to pray. And after comparing himself to the people that he's not like around him, he says, and by the way, God, I fast twice a week, and I tithe or give a tenth of all the income that I receive. These are spiritual sacrifices, spiritual disciplines, spiritual habits that he has in place in his life that should be positive things. He fasts, he tithes. Let me just go ahead and say, there's maybe one or two people in the room who do what this guy does. I don't. His list is 2 items long, and I don't personally do those 2 things. So he is, at least in his mind, better than me because I don't do those 2 things. But again, see, this is kind of how we're all wired. We make lists. How do you feel good about yourself? How do you lay down in your bed at night, and how do you fall asleep, drift off into slumber, relaxed and at peace? Well, some of us make lists. Did I do enough today? Did I do enough for the right people today? What did I do for God today? Well, God, just in case you're not watching, I want to make sure you understand that this is what I did for you today. This is how I did what was unexpected today. This is how I did for you today what other people surely don't. This is how I was exceptional for you today, where everybody else, or some of the people around me at least, are ordinary. He was good at making lists, and sometimes we are too. The point, according to Jesus, is the Pharisee was trying to be justified in himself. This is the lead-in to the story. Jesus noticed, he said, that there were people around who were trusting in themselves to be justified. They thought the answer to these most basic questions in life, am I good enough? Is God okay with me? Can I have peace of mind? Can my heart be at rest? They thought it would come from something they do, from something they create, something they achieve, etc. And all of us in the room, because we're human beings, can do this too. And I'm not sure how you try to do it. The answers will vary. Some of us compare, some of us make lists, but it's bigger than that. Maybe you're hoping that you'll have peace of mind when you make this one change in your life that's been nagging at you, and you know you really want to make it, and you think, you hope that when you make this one change, finally, you'll be comfortable with yourself. You feel at ease. You feel that peace that we all want. There will be other people in the room who are making the bargain with themselves that if I just stop making this one mistake that I tend to make habitually, if I can just go long enough without making this one mistake that seems to plague me, well then finally I can be okay. I'll be good enough. I'll be at peace. I'll be valuable. And on the list goes. If I finally make a little more money and my family is out of financial hardship or distress, or we don't have to live paycheck to paycheck, awesome, finally we'll be at peace as a family. If I mend this one relationship that seems to have gone bad, or if I break off this relationship that is toxic, finally I will be at peace. And on and on and on it goes. This is the cycle of our lives, whether or not you walked in here realizing it today. We are always having these conversations within ourselves about how we're going to be good enough, how it is that God's going to be okay with us, how we have to convince God to bless us because of who we are, who we're not, what we've done, what we've chosen not to do, how much progress we've made, and on down the line it goes. And here's the thing. That guy didn't go home justified. Jesus is absolutely clear in the story about that. The guy who did not go home getting what he wanted to get was the Pharisee. This way is fundamentally, intrinsically, inherently flawed, and it does not work. And so we turn our attention to the tax collector, who stands by himself, head hung low, in the corner of the temple. There he is in the shadows. And the first thing you notice, in contrast to the Pharisee in the story Jesus tells, in this character of the tax collector is, his eyes aren't open. Or if they are, he's not looking at anybody but him. This is not about how he compares to somebody else. This is not about how he's better than somebody else. This is not about how some of what he chooses to do, or some of his spiritual habits, or some of his spiritual sacrifices, some of his spiritual practices are better than, or amount to more than what somebody else does. His eyes are on him, and only him. Because fundamentally, these questions about whether or not I'm good enough, whether or not God is okay with me, whether or not he will bless me, whether or not I can finally be happy, these have nothing to do with anybody else. They have to do with me, just like they have to do with you. Tax collector knows this is something that he, and only he, is accountable for in his own life. He has to find his answers, and his alone. And his prayer is not nearly as verbose. It's not nearly as lengthy as the Pharisees, who compares and makes lists before God Almighty. The tax collector's prayer is far simpler and yet far more profound. He says that day in the shadows of the temple, Lord, have mercy on me, for I am a sinner. Lord, have mercy on me, for I am a sinner. Let's pull that apart and talk about both phrases, because both are essential to finding Christianity's answer, Jesus' answer, to how you can be good enough, or how you can finally be okay with yourself and believe God is okay with you. I am a sinner. Let's just go ahead and admit that's a word most of us are not comfortable with. And for good reason, I should say. Many churches, many Christians use this word to bludgeon people. They call certain kinds of people sinners, certain categories of people, oftentimes the kinds of people that they are not, the categories that they themselves do not fall into. We've all heard that. You understand that. This is why we have an instinctively negative reaction to the word sinner. So much so that some Christians won't even use it about themselves. Now, I'd like to say to you that we are allowing the way that sometimes our Christianity misrepresents that word to miss the beauty of the word, or if you will, the freedom that there is in that word. I am looking at a room full of sinners, and I am one too. You're listening to one right now. And actually me saying that to you, just like it was for the tax collector, is liberating, because I get to tell the truth by using that word about who I am. When I say I am not a sinner, what I am telling you is I'm inconsistent. I'm not altogether bad. I am not Hitler reincarnate. No, I'm inconsistent. And my inconsistency is unpredictable. I'll have good days, and then kind of right out of the blue, surprising me, I'll have a bad one. Or I'll make a good choice in the morning, and then out of the blue, kind of to my surprise, out of nowhere, comes a bad choice in the afternoon. I have a good conversation in the morning, and then out of the blue, I react to something poorly and have a bad conversation in the afternoon. You're no different. You are morally, spiritually, emotionally, and mentally inconsistent. We are flawed at the core. We're incapable of being consistent, always being the same way, always making the right choice. You've heard people say, I'm sure, when this subject comes up, well, I'm not perfect. Well, yeah, no kidding. And neither am I, but it's far more than that. We're unpredictable. We don't know when we're going to make a mistake, say the wrong thing, feel the wrong way about a situation. And all of this takes the weight off of your shoulders and off of mine. It takes the weight off of the caricature that we try to present to one another and to God Himself. That we're better than what we are. That our actions and our reactions and our priorities and the choices we make are more defensible than they often are. No. I'm a sinner, and so are you. And by saying that, we're telling the truth about what it means to be human. And because of what's about to come next, the other part of the prayer, there is no fear in you and I saying that to each other. None. The most dangerous people you know are the people who can't admit that about themselves because they are playing a game. And the game they play is one where if you sense or see in them the inconsistency that is true in us all, they will fight you tooth and nail because they have so much riding on hiding their flawed, feeble, finite humanity from you and from themselves. I am a sinner, the tax collector said. And he has absolutely no fear, as the worst of the worst in his culture, of admitting that before the eyes of God Almighty because of how he starts the prayer. Lord, have mercy on me, for I am a sinner. Here's why you can't find the answer to, am I good enough? Is God okay with me? Can I have peace of mind? Within yourself. You're not consistent enough, and neither am I. There are going to be days when you do enough or achieve enough or things break right enough for you or you're just in a good season of life where things seem to be working out that you could buy into the delusion that, yeah, I kind of got this figured out. I'm kind of okay. God's got to be okay with me. He seems to really be blessing me, and I can be at peace. The minute you exit that season and things get rough, things get tough, you make a few bad choices, you stumble and you fall, or the world is not turning the way you wish, all of that vaporizes. And it's because you and I, by our nature, are inconsistent. And the tax collector in Jesus' story found the one thing in the entire universe that is not inconsistent. God's mercy. There's a verse in the Old Testament written by the prophet Jeremiah, Lamentations chapter 3, verse 22, in which the prophet writes, God's mercies are new every morning. God's mercies toward you and toward me are new every morning. Not the mornings you wake up and deserve it. Every morning. Not the mornings you wake up and pack your kid a healthy lunch instead of throwing a couple of granola bars in a plastic bag and hoping that will suffice. Every morning. Not just the mornings you wake up on time, the mornings you oversleep. Not just the mornings that are after a really good day, but the mornings that are right after your worst day. Not just the mornings when you've been kind to your spouse or your kids, but the mornings after you've made terrible mistakes with both. And you regret the words that you used. Yet every morning, God's mercies are new to you. They never change. They are the anchor that holds. The great Christian author of the 20th century, Henry Nouwen, once was asked by a secular, non-believing friend of his to write him a book. And he said, Henry, I want you to explain to me this whole spiritual thing, this whole Christianity thing, in a way that I can understand, because I'm not a believer. I'm not into the whole God thing. I'm not into the whole Jesus thing. Write me a book so I can understand. His name is Fred. Henry's friend's name was Fred. And then the book, it's very short. I'd highly recommend it to you. It's about 120 pages that Henry wrote in response to the question he was given by Fred. It's called The Life of the Beloved. And the opening chapter to that book, Henry Nouwen writes, Fred, here's the one thing I want you to know. Every day of your life, every hour of your life, every year of your life, you are the beloved of God. You will never have a day in your life where God doesn't love you. Your best, your worst, when you're good, when you're bad. God's mercy is always new to you. This is the only answer from Jesus' perspective and certainly from my own that is going to last the duration of your life. and that can weather the ups and the downs of what you and I experience. It is the only answer to the questions of, am I good enough? Is God okay with me? That make as much sense in your highest moment as in your lowest moment. Because it's not about you. It's about God's mercy and love toward you. You don't deserve it. You're given it. It's a gift. And because you don't deserve it, you have access to 100% of it at any given moment, any given time, regardless of what's going on in your life. I want to suggest to you that the only peace of mind that you as a person are ever going to have in this world has nothing to do with you. Your vocational success, your ability to retire on time, finding meaningful work, meaningful ministry or service within a church or a Christian organization, finding a life partner that's trustworthy. All of these things are worthwhile questions. They will not answer for you whether or not you're good enough, whether or not God is going to bless you, whether or not you can finally be happy. Only God's mercy does that. Because only God's mercy is new every single morning of your life. And Jesus said, you know who went home justified that day? Not the Pharisee, the rotten scoundrel tax collector who threw his hands up to God and said, I'm a sinner. And my whole life I've been one. Be merciful to me, for I am your beloved. Up on the screen are the two contrasting ways that you and I as human beings can try to walk through this world being justified. The one on the left is the one that Jesus says doesn't work. And apparently religious people, because the Pharisee was a religious expert, just like some of us here are Christian experts. We have a lot of seasoning in it. Apparently the box on the left is something that religious people are especially prone to. So we have to be really careful, really mindful. This is not about people out there who are not Christians, who think this way. It's actually about people in here who, like that Pharisee, are prone to think that way because of our religion. And on the right, yeah, it's the only way that you and I can ever find true peace of mind. It's the only way that you and I can ever be comfortable in our own skin. It is the only way that you and I will be able to sleep well at night at age 25 and age 50 and age 80. God, be merciful to me because I'm a broken sinner. And in that, you will find stability and security that you cannot create for yourself, even in your best moments. I want you to take a minute here in the quiet, and I'm going to give you a minute to just allow that to sink in and allow God to speak to you about these two ways to go about life, to try to be good enough and to be okay with yourself. Then we're going to pray something aloud together, and I'll explain why in a moment. So pause in the quiet and take a moment to allow God to speak to you, then we'll pray together.